The message arrived at Barry Goldwater's Senate office through channels so discreet that even his most trusted aides never knew of its existence. No official letterhead, no return address, just a handwritten note on plain paper that would set in motion one of the most unlikely political alliances in American history. Senator Goldwater, the note read in precise handwriting, "We have never met, but I believe we share concerns about the constitutional path our nation is taking on civil rights. Would you be willing to meet privately to discuss approaches that honor both justice and the rule of law? M.L. King, Jr." The date was September 15, 1963. In 18 days, the Civil Rights Act would be introduced in Congress, setting up a confrontation that would define both men's legacies and reshape American politics for generations. What happened in the secret meeting that followed would challenge every assumption about the civil rights movement, conservative ideology, and the relationship between principle and political expediency. Think you know the real story of civil rights and conservative politics? Subscribe and hit that bell, because this hidden chapter will change everything you thought you knew. Tell me in the comments, can constitutional principles and civil rights coexist? Let's uncover the truth they don't want you to know. Barry Goldwater stared at the handwritten note for a full minute before placing it in his desk drawer. The idea of meeting secretly with Martin Luther King, Jr. struck him as either the most important opportunity of his political career or the most dangerous trap he had ever encountered. In the racially charged atmosphere of 1963 Washington, any association between a conservative Republican senator and the leader of the civil rights movement would be political dynamite for both men. But the note's reference to constitutional concerns intrigued Goldwater more than its political risks frightened him. Throughout the growing civil rights debate, the Arizona senator had struggled with the tension between his moral opposition to racial discrimination and his constitutional concerns about federal overreach. King's message suggested that perhaps the civil rights leader shared some of those constitutional worries. Goldwater had built his political reputation on unwavering commitment to constitutional principles, even when those principles conflicted with popular opinion or political expediency. He believed in limited government, states' rights, and strict constitutional construction, not because these principles served conservative political interests, but because he genuinely viewed them as essential to preserving American freedom. The growing civil rights movement presented him with a profound challenge to those beliefs. On one hand, Goldwater found racial segregation and discrimination morally repugnant. His family's department store in Phoenix had been integrated long before federal law required it, and he had personally ensured that African American employees received equal treatment and advancement opportunities. His military experience had shown him the absurdity of racial prejudice and the waste of human potential that discrimination represented. On the other hand, Goldwater worried that federal civil rights legislation would establish precedents for unlimited federal power that could eventually destroy the constitutional system he was sworn to defend. If Congress could override state and local authorities on civil rights grounds, what would prevent future federal intervention in any area where moral arguments could be constructed for national action? King's note suggested that perhaps these concerns were not mutually exclusive, that constitutional principles and civil rights might be reconciled through approaches that honored both justice and the rule of law. The possibility was tantalizing enough to justify the enormous risks that a secret meeting would entail. 3 days later, Goldwater sent his response through the same discreet channels that had delivered King's message. He would meet with the civil rights leader, but only under conditions that protected both men from the political consequences of their association. The meeting would take place in a private residence, with no aides present, and with absolute assurance that neither man would reveal its occurrence without the other's consent. The location chosen was the Georgetown home of a prominent Washington attorney who had served both Democratic and Republican administrations with distinction. The attorney, who insisted on remaining anonymous, had been contacted by mutual intermediaries who understood the historic importance of bringing together two leaders who had never spoken privately, despite their central roles in the decade's most important political debate. On the evening of September 28, 1963, Barry Goldwater arrived at the Georgetown residence through a back entrance, wearing a simple suit and hat that made him less recognizable than his usual senatorial attire. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived 15 minutes later, having driven himself from a hotel downtown where he was staying under an assumed name. The two men who would soon find themselves on opposite sides of the Civil Rights Act were about to discover that their philosophical differences were far more complex than either had imagined. The initial moments of the meeting were awkward, as both men struggled with the surreal nature of their situation. Here was the conservative Republican senator who represented everything the civil rights movement opposed, sitting across from the African-American preacher who embodied everything that many conservatives feared about federal activism. Yet both men also recognized that they were participating in something unprecedented, a genuine attempt to bridge the ideological chasm that divided American politics on the most sensitive issue of their generation. King spoke first, his deep voice carrying the moral authority that had made him the most powerful advocate for civil rights in American history. "Senator Goldwater, I appreciate your willingness to meet with me, despite the obvious political risks. I requested this meeting because I believe we share concerns about the constitutional framework within which civil rights progress must be achieved." Goldwater was surprised by King's opening approach. He had expected moral arguments about the urgency of civil rights legislation, not constitutional discussions about the proper framework for achieving racial justice. "Dr. King," he replied carefully, "I must admit that I'm curious about your constitutional concerns. The civil rights movement has generally embraced federal intervention as necessary to overcome state and local resistance to racial equality." King's response revealed a sophistication about constitutional issues that challenged Goldwater's assumptions about the civil rights leader's political philosophy. "Senator, I have never viewed federal intervention as an end in itself, but as a necessary response to the systematic violation of constitutional rights by state and local governments. My ultimate goal is not federal control of civil rights, but the restoration of constitutional governance that protects individual rights regardless of race." The distinction was subtle but profound. King was arguing that federal civil rights legislation was not an expansion of federal power, but a restoration of constitutional principles that state and local governments had violated. In his view, racial segregation and discrimination represented the real constitutional crisis, and federal intervention was merely the appropriate response to that crisis. Goldwater found himself intrigued by King's constitutional framework, even as he remained skeptical of its practical implications. "Dr. King, I don't dispute that racial discrimination violates fundamental American principles. My concern is that federal intervention to correct state and local violations of those principles will establish precedents that eventually undermine the federal system itself." "Senator," King replied, "I understand your concerns about federal overreach, and I share them to a greater extent than you might imagine. But I would ask you to consider whether the current system of state and local control over civil rights has not already destroyed federalism by creating a situation where the Constitution means different things in different states." The question struck Goldwater with unexpected force. King was arguing that the conservative defense of states' rights was actually protecting a system that had already abandoned constitutional governance in favor of arbitrary local control over fundamental rights. In this view, federal civil rights legislation would restore rather than destroy constitutional uniformity. "You're suggesting that segregation itself is a form of federal system breakdown?" Goldwater asked. "Exactly," King responded. "When state and local governments systematically deny constitutional rights to American citizens based on race, they are violating the federal compact that binds our nation together. Federal intervention to restore those rights is not an expansion of federal power. It's the enforcement of constitutional obligations that state and local governments have abandoned." The conversation continued for over an hour, with both men exploring the constitutional implications of different approaches to civil rights reform. King revealed that he had serious concerns about some aspects of the civil rights legislation being developed in Congress, particularly provisions that might establish unlimited federal authority over private businesses and individual choices. Senator, King explained, my goal has always been to eliminate legal segregation and ensure equal access to public accommodations and voting rights. But I worry that some of the legislation being proposed goes beyond constitutional enforcement into areas where federal authority is questionable. Goldwater was surprised to learn that King shared some of his concerns about the breadth of federal intervention contemplated in the emerging civil rights legislation. The civil rights leader was not the radical advocate for unlimited federal power that conservative opponents had portrayed, but a thoughtful constitutional scholar who recognized the dangers of federal overreach even while supporting federal intervention to protect fundamental rights. Ew. What alternative approach would you suggest? Goldwater asked. King's response outlined a constitutional framework for civil rights that would have surprised both conservative opponents and liberal supporters of the emerging legislation. I believe we need targeted federal intervention to eliminate legal segregation and protect voting rights. But we also need to respect constitutional limits on federal authority over private conduct and local governance. The civil rights leader continued with a proposal that challenged conventional assumptions about both conservative and liberal approaches to civil rights. Rather than comprehensive federal control over all aspects of racial discrimination, we could focus federal intervention on areas where constitutional authority is clearest: voting rights, access to public facilities, and equal protection under law. Private discrimination could be addressed through economic pressure, moral persuasion, and voluntary compliance rather than federal mandate. Goldwater found himself considering a possibility he had never seriously contemplated: supporting targeted civil rights legislation that focused on clear constitutional violations while respecting legitimate concerns about federal overreach. King's approach offered a framework for reconciling civil rights progress with conservative constitutional principles, but it would require both men to challenge the orthodox positions of their respective movements. Dr. King, Goldwater said after a long pause, what you're describing sounds like a constitutional approach to civil rights that both liberals and conservatives might find unsatisfying. Liberals would argue that voluntary compliance with private discrimination is inadequate, while conservatives would argue that any federal intervention in civil rights represents dangerous precedent. King nodded grimly. Senator, I have learned that principled positions often satisfy no one completely while serving the long-term interests of everyone. The question is whether we are willing to pursue constitutional solutions that advance justice without destroying the constitutional system that makes justice possible. The conversation turned to the practical politics of implementing a constitutional approach to civil rights in the charged atmosphere of 1963. Both men recognized that their respective constituencies would view any compromise as betrayal. Civil rights activists would see constitutional limits on federal intervention as acceptance of continued discrimination, while conservatives would see any federal civil rights legislation as the beginning of unlimited federal control. The political reality, King observed, is that both of our movements have developed momentum that may be impossible to control. Civil rights activists are demanding comprehensive federal intervention to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination, while conservatives are opposing any federal civil rights legislation as inherently unconstitutional. Goldwater agreed with King's assessment of the political dynamics that were pushing both movements toward irreconcilable positions. Dr. King, I fear that we're heading toward a confrontation that will damage both civil rights progress and constitutional governance. The legislation being developed in Congress is so broad that it will provoke massive conservative resistance, while conservative opposition is so rigid that it appears to accept the continuation of racial discrimination. Both men understood that they were discussing more than legislative tactics or political strategy. They were exploring whether American democracy was capable of addressing its most fundamental moral crisis without destroying the constitutional principles that made democracy possible. The stakes could not have been higher. King made a proposal that would have shocked both movements: joint public advocacy for a constitutional approach to civil rights that protected fundamental rights while respecting federal system limitations. Senator, what if we were to publicly advocate for civil rights legislation that focused on clear constitutional violations, voting rights, public accommodations, equal protection under law, while acknowledging legitimate concerns about federal overreach in areas where constitutional authority is less clear. The proposal was politically audacious and personally dangerous for both men. King would be accused by civil rights activists of accommodating conservative racism and accepting continued discrimination. Goldwater would be accused by conservatives of betraying constitutional principles and enabling federal tyranny. Both men would face accusations from their core supporters of selling out fundamental principles for political expediency. But the proposal also offered the possibility of achieving civil rights progress without destroying constitutional governance, of advancing racial justice without establishing precedents for unlimited federal power. It represented a principled compromise that honored both men's deepest convictions while acknowledging the legitimate concerns of their opponents. Dr. King, Goldwater said slowly, what you're proposing would require enormous political courage from both of us. We would be challenging the orthodox positions of our respective movements in favor of a constitutional approach that neither movement is prepared to accept. King's response revealed the moral authority that had made him the leader of the civil rights movement. Senator, political courage is meaningless unless it serves principled purposes. If we cannot find constitutional solutions to America's racial crisis, then we will face either continued injustice or constitutional breakdown. Neither outcome serves the long-term interests of freedom and democracy. The meeting continued past midnight as both men explored the practical implications of a joint approach to civil rights legislation. They discussed specific legislative language that might protect voting rights while respecting state authority over election procedures. They considered approaches to public accommodations that would eliminate legal segregation while preserving private property rights. They examined ways to ensure equal protection under law without creating unlimited federal authority over local law enforcement. The constitutional framework they developed was complex and nuanced, reflecting both men's sophisticated understanding of federal system principles and civil rights imperatives. It was also politically impossible, requiring both civil rights activists and conservatives to abandon orthodox positions in favor of constitutional solutions that neither movement was prepared to embrace. As the meeting drew to a close, both men recognized that they had participated in something unprecedented, a genuine attempt to reconcile civil rights progress with constitutional governance. Whether their constitutional framework could survive the political pressures that would soon engulf both movements remained to be seen. Dr. King, Goldwater said as they prepared to leave, regardless of what happens with the legislation currently being developed in Congress, I want you to know that tonight has changed my understanding of the civil rights movement and its relationship to constitutional principles. King's response was equally gracious and equally aware of the political realities they both faced. Senator Goldwater, I hope that our conversation tonight will influence both of our approaches to the challenges ahead, even if political circumstances prevent us from implementing the constitutional framework we have discussed. The two men parted that night knowing that they had discovered unexpected common ground on constitutional principles, but also knowing that the political dynamics of the civil rights debate made joint action nearly impossible. The legislation being developed in Congress was broader than what either man preferred, but both civil rights activists and conservatives had invested too much political capital in their respective positions to accept compromise. Over the following weeks, as the Civil Rights Act took shape in Congress, both Goldwater and King found themselves trapped by the political momentum of their respective movements. The legislation included provisions that went beyond what King had privately acknowledged as constitutionally defensible, while conservative opposition became so rigid that it appeared to reject any federal role in protecting civil rights. Goldwater's ultimate vote against the Civil Rights Act would be portrayed by critics as evidence of racial insensitivity, while supporters would argue that he was protecting constitutional principles against federal overreach. Neither interpretation captured the full complexity of his position or his private recognition that civil rights progress required some form of federal intervention to overcome state and local resistance. King's public support for the Comprehensive Civil Rights Act would be portrayed by conservatives as evidence of his radical commitment to federal control, while supporters would argue that he was demanding necessary federal intervention to protect fundamental rights. Neither interpretation reflected his private concerns about some aspects of the legislation or his willingness to consider constitutional limits on federal authority. The secret meeting between Goldwater and King remained hidden from history, known only to the few individuals who had arranged it and the attorney who had provided the venue. Both men honored their agreement to keep the meeting confidential, understanding that revelation would damage both their political positions and their effectiveness in advancing their respective causes. But the meeting's influence on both men's subsequent approaches to civil rights was profound, even if largely invisible to public observation. Goldwater's opposition to the Civil Rights Act was informed by constitutional concerns that King had helped him understand were legitimate, while his recognition of the moral imperative behind civil rights would influence his later positions on voting rights and racial equality. King's continued advocacy for civil rights was informed by constitutional concerns that Goldwater had helped him understand were serious, while his recognition of the complexity of federal system issues would influence his later approaches to implementing civil rights legislation. Years later, as the Civil Rights Revolution achieved its primary goals, while also raising new questions about the proper scope of federal authority, both men would remember their secret meeting as a moment when constitutional solutions to America's racial crisis had seemed possible. The political dynamics of 1963 had prevented implementation of their constitutional framework, but the principles they had discussed would influence American civil rights policy for decades to come. The Georgetown meeting represented more than a political conversation between unlikely allies. It represented the road not taken in American civil rights policy, the constitutional approach that might have achieved racial justice without establishing precedents for unlimited federal power. Whether that approach would have been more effective than the comprehensive federal intervention that was actually implemented remains one of history's great unanswered questions. What is certain is that both Barry Goldwater and Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrated that principled leaders could find common ground on fundamental issues without abandoning their core beliefs. Their secret meeting proved that constitutional governance and civil rights progress were not mutually exclusive, even if political circumstances prevented implementation of constitutional solutions. The tragedy of the civil rights era was not that principled compromise was impossible, but that political dynamics made principled compromise politically suicidal for leaders in both movements. The constitutional framework that Goldwater and King had developed in their secret meeting offered a path forward that honored both civil rights and constitutional governance, but neither man possessed the political strength to impose that framework on movements that had already committed to more absolute positions. In the end, the Civil Rights Act was passed in its comprehensive form, achieving the civil rights progress that King had devoted his life to advancing while also establishing the precedents for federal authority that Goldwater had warned would threaten constitutional governance. The legislation succeeded in eliminating legal segregation and protecting voting rights, but it also created the federal regulatory apparatus that conservatives would spend the next 50 years trying to limit. The secret meeting between Goldwater and King remained a hidden chapter in civil rights history, known only to the participants and a few trusted intermediaries. But its influence on both men's understanding of the relationship between civil rights and constitutional governance would shape American politics long after both leaders had passed from the scene. Barry Goldwater would spend the remainder of his career defending constitutional principles while acknowledging the moral imperative behind civil rights progress. Martin Luther King Jr. would spend his remaining years advancing civil rights while recognizing the complexity of constitutional issues that principled conservatives had raised about federal intervention. Their secret meeting represented the possibility of a different path in American civil rights policy, one that achieved racial justice while preserving constitutional governance. That path was not taken, but its existence proved that principled leaders could find constitutional solutions to America's most challenging problems when they were willing to transcend partisan orthodoxies in pursuit of fundamental principles. The Georgetown meeting of September 28, 1963, remained one of the most significant political conversations in American history, precisely because it demonstrated that the apparent conflict between civil rights and constitutional governance was not inevitable. With sufficient political courage and constitutional sophistication, leaders could find ways to advance justice while preserving the federal system principles that made self-governance possible. Whether American democracy would have been stronger if that constitutional approach had been implemented remains an open question. What is certain is that both Barry Goldwater and Martin Luther King Jr. proved that principled leadership could transcend ideological divisions when fundamental American values were at stake. Their secret alliance, brief and politically impossible though it was, represented the best of American political tradition, the willingness of principled leaders to seek common ground on fundamental issues despite the political costs of doing so. In an era of increasing polarization and ideological rigidity, their example remains a powerful reminder that constitutional governance and social justice need not be enemies, and that principled compromise can serve the long-term interests of freedom and democracy.